The Valori Empire had conquered 17 different species across 4 galactic arms, and they had never once failed in their mission. Their method was simple and brutal, and it had worked every single time without exception. First, they would destroy all military bases and command centers. Then they would force the governments to surrender, and finally they would take control of all the resources they wanted. Commander Thyrix stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the blue and green planet below him. Earth, the humans called it, and it looked so peaceful and weak from up here in orbit. His intelligence officers had already mapped every military installation on the surface, and his weapons officers had locked onto every single target. "Begin the invasion," Thyrix commanded, and his fleet moved into attack formation. The first strikes hit the major military bases across all the continents. Nuclear silos were destroyed before the humans could even think about launching their weapons. Naval bases burned as Valori plasma fire rained down from the sky. Air Force bases crumbled under the overwhelming firepower of the invasion fleet. Within just 72 hours, the organized military resistance of Earth had been completely crushed. The human governments sent their messages of surrender, one after another, begging for mercy and promising cooperation. Thyrix accepted their surrender with the cold efficiency that had made him famous throughout the Empire. The Valori Occupation Authority established its headquarters in the major capital cities of Earth. Soldiers in gleaming black armor patrolled the streets, and massive warships hovered over every major population center. The humans walked with their heads down, defeated and broken, or so it seemed to the conquering forces. Thyrix sent his victory report to the Empress herself, declaring Earth pacified and ready for resource extraction. He expected commendations and perhaps even a promotion for such a swift and efficient conquest. The first month of occupation was quiet and peaceful, and Thyrix began to relax. But something felt wrong to his senior advisors. The humans were too quiet, too obedient, too cooperative. Other species had resisted longer, had fought harder, had made the occupation difficult in those early days. These humans just went about their daily lives as if nothing had changed. "They are a weak species," Thyrix told his advisors when they raised their concerns. "They know they are beaten, and they have accepted their fate like all the others before them." His advisors nodded, but the unease remained in their eyes. The first incident happened in a small town in a region called Texas. A Valori patrol unit of 12 soldiers, all wearing full combat exoskeletons that could stop any human weapon, entered a drinking establishment to enforce the curfew. The building was called a bar, and it was full of local humans who should have been in their homes. The patrol leader announced the curfew violation and ordered everyone to leave immediately. The humans began to shuffle toward the exits, all except for one old man who remained seated at the bar. He was drinking something called whiskey, and he did not even look at the Valori soldiers. "You there," the patrol leader called out. "You will comply with the curfew order immediately." The old man took another sip of his drink and still did not turn around. The patrol leader walked toward him, annoyed by this display of disrespect. His soldiers followed, spreading out across the bar in standard formation. Nobody saw exactly what happened next. The security footage from outside the bar showed nothing unusual for several minutes, and then there was silence. When the patrol did not report in after an hour, a recovery team was dispatched to investigate. What they found inside that bar would change everything the Valori thought they knew about humans. The 12 soldiers were dead, all of them, and their combat exoskeletons had been torn apart with brutal efficiency. Someone had known exactly where the weak points were, exactly how to disable the shields, exactly how to kill a Valorior in close combat. The weapons of the soldiers had not even been fired, and the old man was gone. The investigation team pulled up his records from the human databases. His name was Earl McKinney. He was 63 years old, and he had a prosthetic knee from an old injury. He had been a farmer for the past 20 years, living alone on a small property outside of town. But there was another entry in his file, something the Valori translators had trouble understanding at first. Under his occupation history, there was a single word that would soon haunt the dreams of every soldier in the occupation force: retired. The human databases explained that Earl McKinney had served in something called the United States Marine Corps for 25 years. He had been deployed to multiple combat zones, had received numerous commendations for valor, and had specialized in close-quarters combat and infiltration tactics. And then he had simply stopped being a soldier and had become a farmer instead. Thyrix read the report 3 times because he could not believe what he was seeing. How could a species take its trained warriors and just release them back into the general population? How could they allow their most dangerous individuals to simply blend in with ordinary civilians? "Find this Earl McKinney," Thyrix ordered. "Bring him to me alive." But Earl McKinney had vanished completely. He was not at his farm, not in any of the surrounding towns, not anywhere the Valori sensors could detect. He had simply disappeared, like a ghost, like he had never existed at all. 3 days later, another patrol went missing in a city called Chicago. 5 days after that, an entire garrison was attacked in something called Argentina. A week later, Valori officers started dying in their own headquarters, killed by methods that left no evidence and no witnesses. The reports that came to Thyrix grew more disturbing each day. The attackers were not young soldiers in uniform. They were old men and women, middle-aged shopkeepers, quiet neighbors who had lived in their communities for decades. They struck without warning, killed without mercy, and vanished without a trace. And every single one of them had that same word in their files: retired. Thyrix began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. He had destroyed Earth's military, yes, but he had not destroyed Earth's warriors. They were still out there, millions of them, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The conquest of Earth had seemed so easy, so complete, so final. But now Thyrix realized that it had not been a conquest at all. It had been a trap. And the Valori had walked right into it with their eyes wide open and their guard completely down. The real war was only just beginning, and Thyrix had no idea how to fight an enemy that looked exactly like everyone else. Commander Thyrix sat alone in his office, surrounded by reports and casualty figures that made no sense to him. In the 6 weeks since the death of that first patrol in Texas, he had lost over 2,000 soldiers to attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. The humans were not using tanks or aircraft or any of the weapons the Valori had destroyed. They were using something far more dangerous. They were using themselves. Thyrix summoned a human liaison to his office, a nervous diplomat named Chen Wei, who had been assigned to help the occupation force understand Earth's culture. Chen entered the room with his head bowed and his hands shaking, clearly terrified of the alien commander who had conquered his world. "I need you to explain something to me," Thyrix said, pointing to the word that appeared in file after file of the humans who had attacked his forces. "What is a veteran?" Chum looked at the screen and took a deep breath before answering. "A veteran is someone who used to serve in the military," he explained in a careful voice. "After their service is complete, they return to civilian life and become ordinary citizens again." Thyrix stared at the human for a long moment. His translator must be malfunctioning, he thought, because what Chen had just said made absolutely no sense. "You release your trained warriors back into the general population?" Thyrix asked. "You simply let them go?" "Yes," Chen replied. "That is how it works in most human nations." Thyrix felt a cold sensation spreading through his body. The Valori had a strict warrior caste system where soldiers lived separately from civilians their entire lives. They were monitored, controlled, and contained in military facilities where they could be watched at all times. The idea of releasing trained killers into the general population was madness. How many of these veterans are there on Earth? Thyrix demanded. Chun did some quick calculations in his head, adding up the numbers from all the major nations. Globally, I would estimate around 200 million, give or take a few million. 200 million. The number hit Thyrix like a physical blow. That was more than the entire population of many species the Valori had conquered. And these were not helpless civilians but trained warriors, who had simply changed their clothes and blended in with everyone else. Thyrix dismissed Chun and began reviewing the intelligence reports with new eyes. What he found made his situation even worse than he had imagined. The attacks were happening everywhere, on every continent, in every occupied city. And the attackers came from every possible background. In Kyiv, a grandmother named Alina Kovalenko had destroyed an entire Valori convoy using homemade explosives and a hunting rifle. She was 71 years old and walked with a cane, but the faded military tattoo on her arm told the story of a different life. She had served as a sniper in her nation's army decades ago, and she had not forgotten any of her skills. In Seoul, a group of middle-aged men who worked as accountants and restaurant owners had assassinated a regional Valori governor and escaped into the subway system. Investigation revealed that they had served together in something called a Special Forces Unit 20 years earlier. They had kept in touch, met for drinks on weekends, and apparently planned for exactly this kind of situation. In São Paulo, a Valori garrison of 50 soldiers had been overrun by what witnesses described as a children's football league. The coaches of that league, it turned out, were former paratroopers who had trained their young players to act as distractions, while the real attack came from hidden positions. The humans were creative in ways that disturbed Thyrix deeply. They used their knowledge of local terrain, their connections to their communities, and their ability to appear completely harmless until the moment they struck. A baker might be a former demolitions expert. A schoolteacher might be a trained assassin. A grandfather playing with his grandchildren might be a decorated war hero who had killed more enemies than Thyrix could count. And there was no way to identify them before they attacked. Thyrix ordered his intelligence officers to develop a screening process, some way to identify the veterans and separate them from the general population. But the task proved impossible. The veterans looked exactly like everyone else. They held ordinary jobs, lived in ordinary homes, and had ordinary families. There were no special markings, no visible signs, no way to tell them apart from the billions of harmless civilians. We could detain everyone over a certain age, one officer suggested. Anyone old enough to have served in a military. That would be half the adult population, another officer replied. We do not have the resources to detain that many humans. Thyrix tried a different approach. He ordered curfews and checkpoints and random searches, hoping to catch the resistance fighters before they could strike. But the veterans were too smart, too experienced, too patient. They waited until the patrols passed. They found the gaps in the security, and they struck when and where the Valori least expected. The resistance grew stronger every day. Weapons that had been hidden before the invasion began appearing in the hands of the fighters. Communications networks that the Valori could not detect allowed the veterans to coordinate their attacks across entire continents. Supply lines that seemed to come from nowhere kept the resistance fed and armed. And then Thyrix discovered something even more terrifying. The veterans were not fighting alone. They were training others. Reports came in of young humans who had never served in any military, carrying out attacks with professional precision. Teenagers who had never held a weapon before were now sniping Valori officers from hidden positions. Office workers and factory employees were building bombs and planning ambush. The veterans were passing on their knowledge, creating new warriors from the civilian population. For every veteran the Valori killed or captured, 10 more fighters seemed to take their place. Thyrex realized that he was not fighting an army. He was fighting an entire species that had the potential for violence bred into their very nature. The humans had spent their entire history fighting each other, developing new weapons and tactics and strategies. They had thousands of years of warfare encoded in their culture, their stories, their very blood. And now all of that violence was focused on the Valori. Thyrex sent an urgent message to the Valori homeworld, requesting reinforcements and guidance. He explained the situation as clearly as he could, describing the invisible enemy that hid among the civilians and the impossible task of pacifying a world where anyone could be a soldier. The response from the Empire was swift and decisive. High Commander Valith herself would travel to Earth to take control of the situation. She was the most decorated officer in the entire Valori military, famous for crushing rebellions on a dozen different worlds. Thyrex felt a small measure of hope when he received this news. Surely Valith would know how to defeat these stubborn humans. Surely she would find a way to break their will and end this impossible resistance. But deep in his heart, Thyrex knew the truth. He had seen the look in the eyes of the humans they captured, the cold determination that no amount of torture or threats could break. These were not people who would surrender. These were people who would fight until the very last one of them was dead. And there were billions of them. High Commander Valith arrived on Earth with a fleet of reinforcements and a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. She had crushed rebellions on 12 different worlds, and she had never failed to break the will of a conquered species. The humans would be no different, she believed, once she understood their psychology and found their weakness. Her first order was to bring her the most dangerous human prisoner they had captured. She wanted to study this species, to understand what made them so difficult to control, and to find the key to their submission. The guards brought her a man named Marcus Jackson. He was 45 years old, with gray hair at his temples and scars on his arms that told stories of many battles. According to his file, he had served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps before becoming a high school history teacher. A history teacher. Valith found this detail fascinating and disturbing. This man had spent 2 decades learning how to kill, and then he had chosen to spend his time teaching children about the past. What kind of species would waste such a valuable military asset? Jackson was brought into the interrogation room with his hands bound and his feet chained. Despite his situation, he walked with his head held high and showed no fear in his eyes. He sat down in the chair across from Valith and actually smiled at her. "You must be the boss they sent to fix things," Jackson said. "How is that working out for you?" Valith ignored his question and studied him carefully. He did not look like a warrior, not in the way the Valori understood warriors. He had no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no visible weapons. He looked soft and weak, like any other human. But the report said this man had killed 11 Valori soldiers with his bare hands before he was finally captured. 11 armored warriors, defeated by a creature that looked like he should be teaching children. "Your government surrendered to us," Valith said through her translator. "The war is officially over. Why do you continue to fight?" Jackson leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Lady, you conquered our governments," he said. "You did not conquer us." "I do not understand the distinction," Valith replied. "When a government surrenders, the people must follow." "That is not how it works with humans," Jackson explained. "Our governments are not our masters. They are our servants, and we can replace them whenever we want. Just because some politician signed a piece of paper does not mean the rest of us agreed to it." Valith frowned at this strange concept. In the Valori Empire, the word of the government was absolute law. Citizens obeyed because that was their function, their purpose, their entire reason for existing. The idea that ordinary people could simply ignore their rulers was alien to her in every sense of the word. "Tell me about your military structure," Valeth commanded. "How do you organize your warrior caste?" "We do not have a warrior caste," Jackson replied with another smile. "That is what you do not understand about us. Every human is a potential warrior. The grandmother who bakes cookies for her grandchildren could have been a sniper in her youth. The accountant who does your taxes could have been a special forces operator. The teacher who educates your children could have spent years learning 100 different ways to kill you." He leaned forward, and his eyes grew cold and hard. "You want to know the funny thing about humans?" Jackson asked. "We are all descended from survivors. For a million years, our ancestors faced predators and disasters in each other. The weak ones died. The cowards died. The ones who gave up died. Only the survivors passed on their genes. And that is what we are. An entire species of survivors who will do whatever it takes to keep surviving." Valeth felt uncomfortable under his gaze, though she would never admit it. "You are a fragile species," she pointed out. "You have no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. By every measure, you should be easy to conquer. And yet, here we are," Jackson replied. "Still fighting, still killing your soldiers, still making you miserable. You know why? Because we do not need claws or venom to be dangerous. We have something better. We have brains that never stop thinking about how to kill our enemies. We have spirits that refuse to break no matter how much you hurt us. We have a stubbornness that goes all the way down to our bones." He pulled against his restraints, and the guards tensed. "You cannot beat us," Jackson said. "Not really. You can kill us, sure, one by one, but for every human you kill, 10 more will take their place. And every one of those 10 will spend their entire life looking for a way to make you pay. You will never sleep peacefully on this world. You will never walk the streets without fear. You will never know which of the smiling faces around you is planning to slit your throat in the night." Valeth stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the human city below. The streets were full of people going about their daily lives, shopping and working and raising their children. They looked so ordinary, so harmless, so completely unremarkable. But now she knew the truth. Any one of those ordinary people could be a killer waiting for the right moment. The old woman carrying groceries could be a combat veteran. The young man on the bicycle could be a trained assassin. The children playing in the park could have parents who were teaching them to fight. "You cannot tell which of them are dangerous," Jackson called from behind her. "That is what is driving you crazy, is it not? You look at us and you see weak, fragile creatures, but you never know which of those weak creatures is going to be the one who ends you." Valeth turned back to face him. "How do we make peace with you?" she asked. What would it take to end this resistance? Jackson actually laughed out loud at that question. "You cannot make peace with us," he said. "Not while you are occupying our world. We are humans, and we do not submit to anyone. We did not submit to each other for thousands of years of wars, and we are certainly not going to submit to some aliens who came from the sky and think they own us." He met her eyes with a look of absolute certainty. "You have only 2 choices," Jackson told her. "You can leave or you can die. There is no third option. There is no compromise. There is no way to make us accept your rule. You can kill millions of us, and the survivors will just hate you more. You can destroy our cities, and we will fight you from the ruins. You can take everything we have, and we will still find ways to hurt you." Valeth dismissed the guards and sat alone in the empty room for a long time. She had broken a dozen species before, found their pressure points, exploited their weaknesses. But this species had no pressure points. Their weakness was also their strength. They were individuals who could think for themselves and choose to fight even when their leaders told them to surrender. And there were 8 billion of them. For the first time in her long career, High Commander Valith began to consider the possibility that this war could not be won. The losses had become unsustainable, and everyone in the Valori command structure knew it. In the 8 months since the invasion began, they had lost over 50,000 soldiers to the human resistance. 50,000 warriors from a species that was supposed to be weak and easy to conquer. The soldiers themselves had begun to refuse assignments. Patrol units would report equipment malfunctions rather than walk the streets of human cities. Garrison commanders would send urgent requests for extraction, claiming their positions were indefensible. Morale had collapsed completely, and discipline was starting to break down. High Commander Valith called a meeting of all senior officers to discuss the situation. The faces around the table were tired and haunted, marked by months of fighting an enemy they could not see and could not predict. "We need more troops," one commander argued. "If we flood the planet with enough soldiers, we can control every street and every building." "We do not have enough soldiers in the entire empire to control this world," another officer replied. "There are 8 billion humans. Even if we deployed our entire military, we would be outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Commander Thyrix stood up and activated the display screen. He had been working on a detailed analysis of the enemy, and what he had discovered was even worse than anyone expected. "The veterans are not even our biggest problem," Thyrix explained. "We have identified other categories of dangerous humans that we did not even know existed." He brought up the first category on the screen. "Hunters," he said. "These are civilians who kill animals for sport and food. They are trained in tracking, stealth, and long-range shooting. In the North American continent alone, there are over 100 million of them." The officers stared at the number in disbelief. "Then there are the martial artists," Thyrix continued. "Humans who train in hand-to-hand combat for recreation. There are hundreds of millions of them spread across the planet. Many of them have spent decades perfecting their skills." He brought up another category: competitive shooters. These are humans who practice with firearms as a hobby. They can hit targets at ranges that should be impossible for their primitive weapons. There are tens of millions of them in every major nation. Another category appeared on the screen: survivalists and preppers. These are humans who have been stockpiling weapons, food, and supplies specifically in anticipation of a catastrophic event. They have underground bunkers, hidden caches, and detailed plans for exactly this kind of scenario. Valith leaned forward with growing alarm. "You are telling me that these humans prepared for an alien invasion as a hobby?" "Yes, High Commander," Thyrix replied. "They have entertainment media about alien invasions. They have been imagining this war and rehearsing for it in their minds for over a century. When we arrived, they already had plans and strategies ready to use against us." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Valori were not fighting a military force that could be defeated in battle. They were fighting an entire civilization that had been unconsciously preparing for this moment for generations. One of the intelligence officers brought up additional data. "We have analyzed human culture and history," she reported. "These creatures have been fighting each other continuously for their entire existence as a species. They have developed weapons and tactics for every possible situation. They have fought in jungles, deserts, mountains, cities, and even underwater. There is no environment where they cannot wage war." She hesitated before continuing. "And there is something else. The humans have a concept they call guerrilla warfare. It is a doctrine of fighting designed specifically for situations where a weaker force faces a stronger enemy. They have thousands of years of experience with this type of combat, and they have taught it to resistance fighters across their entire world." Valith slammed her fist on the table. "How did our intelligence fail so completely?" she demanded. How did we not know any of this before we invaded? We knew the facts, Thyrix admitted, but we did not understand what they meant. We saw that humans had many wars and assumed they were a violent but disorganized species. We did not realize that all those wars had been training them for exactly this moment. Another officer spoke up with a grim expression. There is also the matter of their psychology. We have interrogated hundreds of prisoners, and they all display the same characteristics. They do not fear death. They actively seek opportunities to sacrifice themselves if it means harming us. They find meaning and purpose in fighting against impossible odds. He shook his head slowly. They are not motivated by survival like other species. They are motivated by defiance. The very act of resistance gives them satisfaction, even when they know they cannot win. This makes them completely unpredictable and incredibly dangerous. Valeth sat in silence as the reports continued. Each new piece of information painted a darker picture of the situation. The humans were not just fighting to protect their world. They were fighting because fighting was part of their fundamental nature. Finally, she dismissed the other officers and sat alone with Thyrix. "What is your honest assessment?" she asked him. Thyrix took a deep breath before answering. "This occupation cannot succeed," he said. "We can continue to fight, and we can continue to take losses, but we will never control this planet. The humans will resist us forever, and they will never stop. Even if we killed 90% of them, the remaining 10% would still be fighting us 100 years from now." He pulled up a final report on his screen. "The cost of maintaining this occupation is already exceeding the value of any resources we could extract. Our soldiers are dying faster than we can replace them. And the humans are actually getting stronger, not weaker. They are learning our tactics, studying our technology, and adapting their strategies. Every day we stay here, they become more dangerous." Valeth stared at the reports and the casualty figures and the projections for the future. Everything she saw pointed to the same conclusion, a conclusion that had never been reached in 4,000 years of Valori conquest. They had invaded a world they could not hold. She began composing a message to the Empress, choosing her words carefully. This would be the most difficult report she had ever written. She would have to explain that the mighty Valori Empire had been defeated, not by a superior military force, but by a species of soft, fragile creatures who simply refused to accept defeat. The Empress would not be pleased. But the truth could no longer be denied. Earth was unconquerable, and the only sane option was to leave before the losses became even more catastrophic. The official announcement from the Valori Empire called it a strategic reallocation of resources, but everyone in the galaxy knew the truth. The mighty conquerors who had never lost a war were retreating from a small blue planet on the edge of an unremarkable solar system. The impossible had happened, and the news spread across 1,000 worlds. The Empress herself had made the decision after reading High Commander Valeth's report. She had raged and threatened and demanded solutions, but in the end, even she could not deny the mathematics of the situation. The occupation was bleeding the Empire dry, and there was no path to victory that did not involve unacceptable losses. The withdrawal began on a cold morning in the 9th month of the occupation. Valori soldiers abandoned their garrisons and marched toward the landing zones where transport ships waited to carry them away. They walked with their weapons ready and their eyes scanning every window, every rooftop, every shadow. Even now, at the moment of their departure, they could not relax. The humans watched them go with cold eyes and colder smiles. A few isolated attacks struck the retreating columns, last acts of defiance from fighters who could not let their enemies leave without bleeding just a little more. Marcus Jackson was among the prisoners released as part of the withdrawal agreement. He walked out of the detention center with hundreds of other captured resistance fighters. blinking in the sunlight and breathing the free air. His hands were still raw from the restraints, and his body still ached from months of captivity, but he was alive and free. A Valori officer was waiting outside the gates, and she walked toward Jackson with a strange expression on her alien face. He recognized her as one of the interrogators who had questioned him during his imprisonment. "Your people are confusing creatures," the officer said through her translator. "You have no natural weapons and no armor. You are physically fragile and technologically inferior. By every measure we use to assess species, you should have been easy to conquer." Jackson stretched his arms and rolled his shoulders, feeling his joints crack after months of confinement. "And yet, here we are," he replied. "You are leaving, and we are staying." "How?" the officer asked. "How does a species so weak become so dangerous?" Jackson looked around at the other freed prisoners, at the ordinary men and women who had fought an empire to a standstill. There were grandmothers and teenagers, factory workers and teachers, farmers and doctors. None of them looked like warriors, but all of them had proven themselves in battle. "Because we are not just soldiers," Jackson answered. "We are survivors. Every single one of us is descended from thousands of generations of people who refused to die. Our ancestors faced ice ages and plagues and famines and endless wars. The weak ones died and the cowards died, and the ones who gave up died. Only the stubborn ones survived, and we are what remains." He turned back to face the Valori officer. "You see a soft species with no claws and no armor, but you do not see what is inside us. You do not see the fire that burns in every human heart, the stubbornness that goes all the way down to our souls. We will fight when we should surrender. We will resist when we should submit. We will keep struggling even when all hope is gone." The officer nodded slowly, a gesture she had learned from her time among humans. "We will not return to this world," she said. "The Empire has learned its lesson." "Smart," Jackson agreed. "Very smart. But others might come," the officer continued. "Other empires, other conquerors, other species who think they can take your world." Jackson smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "Then we will be ready for them too. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. We face whatever threatens us, and we find a way to survive. It does not matter if the enemy is a saber-toothed tiger or a rival tribe or an alien empire. We adapt, we fight, and we win." The officer turned and walked back toward the waiting transport ships. Jackson watched her go, then started walking in the other direction, toward the city, toward his home, toward his life. The streets were already returning to normal. Shops were reopening, and people were emerging from hiding. Children played in parks while their parents watched with tired but happy eyes. The occupation was ending, and humanity was reclaiming its world. But Jackson knew that the victory was just the beginning. The galaxy now knew that Earth existed, and the galaxy now knew that Earth was full of valuable resources and stubborn creatures. Other empires would hear the story of the Valori defeat, and some of them might think they could succeed where the Valori had failed. They would be wrong. Jackson stopped at a small cafe and ordered a cup of coffee. He sat at an outdoor table and watched the people walking by, the ordinary humans going about their ordinary lives. None of them looked like warriors, but he knew better. Every single one of them carried the potential for violence in their genes, the legacy of 1,000,000 years of survival. The grandmother walking her dog might have been a combat medic who had saved lives under fire. The teenager on the skateboard might have a grandfather who was teaching him to shoot. The businessman in the expensive suit might have spent years in special operations before becoming an executive. They were all soldiers, every single one of them, whether they knew it or not. The military training might be formal or informal. The combat experience might be real or simulated, but the willingness to fight was universal. It was part of being human. Jackson finished his coffee and started walking again. He had a job to return to, students to teach, a life to resume. The war was over, at least for now, and it was time to go back to being a civilian. But he would never forget the lessons of the occupation, and neither would the rest of humanity. They had proven something important during those 9 months of resistance, something that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. Humans were not to be conquered. Humans were not to be enslaved. Humans were not to be underestimated. The galaxy had sent its mightiest empire against a species that looked weak and fragile, and that species had sent the empire running. Other powers would take note, and other powers would remember. And somewhere out among the stars, in the councils of a dozen different civilizations, the word was spreading. There was a world called Earth, populated by strange creatures called humans, and those creatures were far more dangerous than they appeared. Their warriors hid among their civilians, invisible and patient, waiting for any enemy foolish enough to challenge them. Let the galaxy beware. Let the empires take warning. Let every would-be conqueror think twice before turning hungry eyes toward that small blue world. Because the monsters of Earth looked just like everyone else, and they were always ready for a fight.